So good morning to everybody. Hopefully everybody could hear me, and I should say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are and what country you're in at the moment. Can I welcome everybody to the webinar today? Thank you for taking time out of your very busy calendars to join us, and hopefully you're going to enjoy the next couple of hours. We've got a great lineup of speakers to talk to us, and I'm sure it's going to be a really worthwhile event. My name's Mark Booth. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Food Standards Australia New Zealand. I'd like to formally open proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on today, wherever we are in the country, and also to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I go over to our Wellington office to Glenn to ask Glenn to do a welcome from the New Zealand side?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai te mana kaonga kai ahi te reiri me Aotearoa. E aha te kai o te rangatira, e kōrero, e kōrero, e kōrero. So that's g'day and welcome. And if the question is, what is the food of the leader? We would answer, it's language, it is dialogue, it is engagement. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Glenn. That's great. Thank you. So once again, welcome to everybody, and thank you for attending our very first webinar. A special thank you and welcome to those joining us from Victoria, and thank you for joining us in this event. It's almost 2 years ago now since we did our last stakeholder event. We got together in Sydney, and we had around about 250 people join us to do a discussion session, really looking at the future of the food regulation system and where we might be in 2 to 3 years' time. I think it's fair to say that at the time, none of us would have imagined where we would actually be in 2 to 3 years' time. I don't think anybody would have realised or thought the situation that we'd be in at the time. So from an organisational perspective, I guess we kind of imagined that we'd do an event like that every couple of years. And we had actually booked Melbourne for the beginning of next year, but it became apparent that really probably wasn't going to happen. So we decided to cancel that event and replace it with this webinar. And hopefully, if things go well, this may be the first of a number of them. In terms of what's gone on over the last couple of years, well, COVID and the bushfire crisis within Australia have really put a spotlight onto food supply chain and its ability to actually respond and to actually be able to function during a time of increased demand and also really national and international crisis. Whilst the food supply chains in Australia and New Zealand have really worked exceptionally well, and have really stepped up to the challenges, we kind of thought it was a good time to really stop and just have a think and see and reflect and think about what's happened and how we actually respond to these things going forward. So there's a number of issues going on at the moment. As I say, those areas around the bushfires and around COVID. Also, ministers announced last year that they were going to do a bit of a review of the food system, the food regulatory system, a bit of a review of FSANZ. So that's happening at the moment as well. So it's a really good time to actually take stock, I think, and where we're going to. So that really brings me to the theme of today's webinar, which is 2020 Hindsight, Lessons Learned and Opportunities for Better Food Regulation. As I said, we're joined by some exceptionally good panelists today, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for making themselves available and for pulling the presentations and the talk together. I know it's not easy to do when you're exceptionally busy. I'm also very pleased to be able to welcome so many attendees, including from food businesses, industry and government. At the last count earlier on today, we had over 800 registrations for this event, which is just phenomenal. It really is a huge number, and it really gives a strong sense of support, I think, for stakeholders and a commitment to food regulation and thinking about where we are heading to moving forward. Just a small housekeeping thing before I go. Just at the end of the event, there will be a small survey, and if you could take time out to fill that in and let us know your thoughts for future events and what topics we might look at next time. Okay, that's quite enough from me. Let's get into the main event. So I'm going to hand over to our two facilitators for the day. First of all, we have Mr. Glenn Neal, who's the General Manager of our Risk Management and Information branch, and he's based in our Wellington office. And we also have Sonia Bradley, who's our Special Projects Advisor, and she's based in our Canberra office. So once again, thank you from me, and I hope you enjoy the next couple of hours. Glenn, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much for the opening up, Mark. Before we kick off and get to that great panel you talked about, I'll introduce them shortly, but we just have a few quick housekeeping matters. Now, unfortunately, given the number of participants online, we're absolutely staggered by those registration numbers, as Mark said. So audience microphones will be muted and participant video is disabled. We'll also turn off the chat, but there is a Q&A button there at the bottom of Zoom. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, but if you're not, you should be able to find that and you can enter a question. Those questions will be really important to us for the second half of this session. So we want to make it as interactive and as interesting to you as possible. We aim to get through as many questions as possible, but that are relevant to today's discussion, but obviously due to volumes, we may not be able to get to them all. So apologies in advance if we don't get to your particular question. The webinar will be recorded, made available on our website as soon as possible after today's event. In addition to the survey that will be available, there will be a survey available to participants to fill out at the end, as Mark said. We also have a poll open, just a quick poll for you to let us know where you're from, and that will be helpful for us. So, as Mark said, the theme for today, 2020 hindsight. I'm sure there's 7.8 billion people on the planet who can't wait for 2020. There's that poll. Just get rid of that. I'm sure there's 7.8 billion people on the planet who can't quite wait soon enough for 2020 to be behind us and for us to be thinking about what we've learnt and where the opportunities for better food regulation lie into the future. The key aim for today is to provide the opportunity to learn about the impacts of COVID from different perspectives on the food system. And those perspectives include regulators, public health, food industry, and consumer representatives. This will help inform us about the future needs of the system so that we can all be as best prepared as possible for the future challenges and grabbing those opportunities. We do hope to use this opportunity to share experiences and draw out the lessons learned and discuss those new opportunities, challenge ideas and perspectives, and help to inform a roadmap for the future. So in times of peril and I guess uncertainty, we historically have looked to our leaders and looked to the stars to help us navigate. And with that in mind, I'll introduce the first of those stars, Catherine Rich, the Chief Executive from the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
Okay, and also joining Catherine on today's panel is Dr. Lisa Zabol, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Food Authority. Welcome, Lisa, who's...
Hi, Glenn.
Oh, great to see you.
Yes.
It's fantastic. You don't know how happy that makes us to see you.
I was very happy too.
Okay, Alan Kirkland, who joins us from the CEO of Choice.
Thanks, Glenn. Always a pleasure to speak at a FSANZ event, even if it's online.
Super, thanks, Alan. And Professor Linda Tapsell joins us from the University of Wollongong. Welcome, Linda. And last but by no means least, today's wild card, if you like. Some may regard him as a bit of a joker, but Peter Carter joins us. He's the chap in charge of innovation at something called GS1. G'day, Peter.
Glenn, thank you for having me. I promised no dad jokes today, so.
Well, we'll see how we go, Peter. We'll see how we go. Okay, well, I'm going to start by turning to Catherine Rich. Catherine, as I mentioned, is the CEO and has been the CEO of the Food and Grocery Council here in New Zealand for about 11 years, since 2009. She's also the chairperson of the Parliamentary Education Trust, a board member of the children's charity Barnardo's New Zealand, and a council member of the National Advisory Council on the Employment of Women. Now, Catherine was a MP of the New Zealand Parliament for 3 terms from 1999 to 2008. Started as a very young person, Catherine, and prior to that held a number of agribusiness roles working for the Ministry of Agriculture here in New Zealand, something called the Foundation for Research, Science and Technology. And prior to that worked in Alliance Textiles and a sheep genetics company. Catherine has a BA and a BCom in Economics and Marketing. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Glenn.
So, what's been going on? How's the last 6 months been for you, and how's the last 6 months been for New Zealand food and grocery manufacturers?
Well, certainly the last 6 months have been very challenging, but I'd like to start by thanking FSANZ, government officials and all food industry people on this line, because the work that they have done, that you have all done, has meant that we have kept the shelves full and people getting what they need to. I remember Lord Cameron of Dillington said once that most people are 9 meals away from anarchy, and certainly if they start to see empty shelves, they start to get a bit concerned. But one of the things from COVID, and no one would have predicted, was that a non-food item became the poster product for COVID, being toilet paper. But look, you know, there have been some real challenges over the last 6 months or so, but I think one of the best things has been regulators, officials in the food industry have worked together. I saw someone describe what the shutting down of parts of the food industry and the halt to global supply chains as akin to undoing one of the world's most complex jigsaw puzzles. And I think that's right. It showed up some vulnerabilities. The food system has been very robust and resilient, but it has also shown quite a lot of fragility in some areas, particularly with rising protectionism, with some countries deciding to hold on to their food for food security reasons, and some other countries making some decisions that had an impact here. Now, we've got a very good system that can deal with big bumps in demand, but what we saw was a tidal wave surge, and some firms selling as much as 3 months stock in a week. Now, no food supply system has seen that sort of impact ever. Now, one of the things that I think we need to talk about, and that's why I think the seminar is so important, is we need to learn from the last 6 months. And I think there are 4 areas that, from our perspective, I think we can do better. If New Zealand and Australia is going to yo-yo in and out of lockdown, we have to get better at it. For example, we need to keep the food supply and those who support the food supply going. And unfortunately, the last lockdown in Auckland ended up creating more disruption for us, interestingly, than level 4 previously. And that was basically because essential food workers couldn't travel. So that would be the first thing that I would say we need to learn from, allowing the food supply to continue to function as much as possible, and recognising that the food industry has very global supply chains. So the second thing is, I think we in the food industry have to take responsibility for making sure all officials, as much as possible, have good awareness of the decisions they're making. So here in New Zealand, we've been lobbying for the decisions about food to be made by food regulators, MPI, MB, FSANZ, etc., and have had some frustration over some of the decisions made by the Ministry of Health. In the last few weeks, I've had to explain the reasons why a flour miller has to go to work to mill flour, and why yeast is important for bread making, and why manufacturing and machinery engineers are important for food manufacturing. Now, these are not the kind of conversations we ever have to have with FSANZ or the Ministry for Primary Industries. The third thing is, though, as we move forward, I think we need to prioritise our food workers and make sure that they get priority when it comes to vaccinations. Here in New Zealand, we were really disappointed that, despite being frontline workers who saw the most people, that we were rebuffed when we asked the opportunity for them to be vaccinated. And you know, let's hope we get a COVID vaccine soon, but we hope that that's something that will be taken into account. But you know, the fourth thing has to be understanding that we have very complex supply chains. We're producing food, a lot of it's seasonal. And despite the fact that the supermarkets and convenience stores did a fantastic job, they are not the only place that receives food. Here in New Zealand, we faced a tsunami of pork and chicken and all sorts as butchers and greengrocers and other markets were closed. And I think there is a way for those retailers to continue to trade safely and make sure that food flows through. But, we've got enough anecdotes to write a book. I'm sure many, we won't, but I'm sure many of us could. But understanding the way the food system works together is really important. We had some near misses here in terms of animal welfare. 160,000 chickens about to hatch, and staff, the 40 staff who look after them couldn't come to work. Sadly, a beekeeper had to face 2.5 million bees starving because he couldn't get in to feed them. As we move forward, I think we need to continue to work together and make sure that good regulation and decisions about food are fit for purpose. So probably a long-winded answer, Glenn, but that's what's been on our mind.
Well, you answered my first 4 questions there, Catherine, so well done indeed. So, of course, the elephant in the room, I'll just go back. You did acknowledge the work of all the food and manufacturing staff out there, and it's been fantastic to note the public acclaim for our essential workers, particularly in retail as well. As you mentioned, grocery staff have become certainly, their work, I think, is taken for granted on a day-to-day basis, and the way the entire food and grocery sectors in both countries have supported, maintained supplies. It will take the occasional panic buying issue. Don't worry, Ellen, we'll come to you on that in a moment. But it's been quite remarkable. However, New Zealand's missing about 300,000 visitors every month, Catherine. So we've got a lot less mouths to feed. There's 300,000 there's 300,000 visitors. Of course, are our missing tourists. What are the opportunities you see for New Zealand and indeed for Australia there?
Well, I think every single food manufacturer has to make sure that they are looking to maintain their export relationships. And we all know Zoom is great for maintaining relationships, but it is quite challenging, building new markets. But we've just got to make sure that we do that, and that we are going to see significant contraction in the food supply here. But the food industry is very resilient. When each challenge pops up, manufacturers get out there and say, what can I do? But there is this belief that during lockdown, the food industry had an easy time because, of course, people saw queues at supermarkets, etc. But of course, Glenn, those food companies who had exposure to food service, to hospitality, tourism, etc., got absolutely smashed. So we've got firms here that are really working hard to get back on their feet, and that's why making sure that food regulation and organisation as we go in and out of lockdown is as efficient as possible. And I think consumers would expect nothing less from us. Thanks,
Catherine. Tremendous insights. Dr. Lisa Szabo. Lisa joined the New South, and we'll come back to you in a minute, Catherine. So Dr. Lisa Szabo joined the New South Wales Food Authority back in 2006 as its Chief Scientific Officer and became the Chief Executive Officer in 2015. So the Food Authority is the statutory authority within the Department of Regional New South Wales, and is responsible for food regulation across the entire supply chain. Prior to joining New South Wales Food Authority, Lisa worked for CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, for 11 years, managing and leading long-term research projects for various food industry sectors. Lisa, what have been the major challenges for food regulators at the coalface since COVID-19?
Well, the first, hi everyone, the first challenge that food regulators had to face was really providing the community with confidence that COVID-19 isn't something that is transmitted by food. And we were able to do that very readily. Coronavirus is a really large family of viruses. They cause illnesses like the common cold, but also really severe respiratory illnesses like MERS and SARS. But what we have learned through those experiences is that food isn't a vehicle, and that was a very important thing to be able to provide that confidence to the community as well as to the food industry as a whole. I'd have to say that certainly, in January, by the end of January, there was unfortunately a large number of hoax emails going around that were very culturally directed. And, you know, we've even had here in Sydney, you know, one that was talking about the Bureau of Diseaseology, which was doing a whole lot of testing of food, supposedly, and finding COVID-19 in these foods. And that was just wrong. And I'd have to say that that wasn't the only example. There were others. Rather disappointingly, I have read many emails that have come through to our contact centre or correspondences into our minister's office that really start with the words, "I'm not racist, but." And you certainly have seen, you know, a lot of restaurants and cafes, you know, from a certain ethnic background who really struggled early on for no reason whatsoever. And it was just because of this misinformation that was circulating. The other thing was that, you know, as a food regulator, you are a point of contact to food businesses, to the food industry. We engage with the industry on a very regular basis. So we recognised early on we had to step up and into this infectious disease space because our stakeholders were coming to us for advice. And that's what we did. We have a really terrific partnership with our health colleagues here in this state, and the same would be across many jurisdictions in Australia. So we were able to work together to figure out, well, what are those questions that we, as a food regulator, are able to answer up front for businesses so that we're a first point of resolution, and what are those that we need to be directing to others, but making sure that when we do get a stakeholder reaching out to us, that we are directing them to the people who can provide them with the answer. So that's how we began to engage in this space, and to recognise that we too had a role in assisting in an infectious disease space, which is not really where we often go to. Catherine mentioned the essential service aspect, and again, early on, that was a key thing. Here in Australia, industry couldn't see it. They couldn't see those words, that the food industry is an essential service. And there are a whole lot of different public health orders that came out, and they were there as an essential service by virtue of exception, but the words weren't there. So again, that was creating a lot of concern, not just for the food industry, but, you know, I had phone calls from the laboratory that does our food testing asking the question, well, are we an essential service? We service predominantly the food industry and play a really important role. Are we able to continue when restrictions were coming into place? And yes, of course, they could. The key thing, though, is being an essential service, some businesses also assumed that they were immune to a public health response, that if they happened to get a COVID positive employee, that the response towards them wouldn't, well, perhaps there wouldn't be one, which isn't the case at all. So again, we worked very hard, and there was a lot of leadership that came through the poultry meat industry to bring information out to food businesses, how they can help manage their workforce if by chance they did have a COVID positive employee. So Glenn, they're just a couple of things that we did early on. I probably should also say that, you know, as a food regulator, life also has to go on in the food safety space. So the community needs to have the confidence that food safety is still a priority for food businesses. So we, just for our own staff, put in place our own business continuity plans so that people were able to work from home when that directive did come to us as a public sector. But we were also deemed to be essential workers, so that if we needed to come to work or perform our usual duties, which is engaging with the business on site, we were able to do that. And we did do a bit of reorganising in terms of our audit schedule. We have a role in the vulnerable persons space. So for a period of time, we were pulling away from going into hospitals and aged care and focusing on other areas. And of course, as situations change, and now we're looking to businesses to have a COVID safe plan in place, we find that our officers are out there not only looking at food safety aspects, but they're also looking at those COVID safe aspects. It would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge that, you know, in some communities, in some businesses, you know, they had the quadruple whammy. There were businesses that were in drought. In New South Wales, we had the bushfires. Those fires were put out because it rained, and that rain brought floods. And then we had COVID-19. So there's some communities and businesses out there who were really, really struggling, and, you know, their resilience is to be admired.
Yeah, unfortunately, Lisa, there's no crisis management rule which says you can only have one crisis at a time. But how do you make sure that you're stepping back big enough to look and see what else is coming?
Sorry, I missed that question, Glenn.
Any other threats? I mean, how have you been able to maintain the capacity? We
certainly did have to manage concurrent threats. So through the first 2 or 3 months of this year, there were 1,000 people out there who were suffering from salmonellosis. Large majority of those were in Queensland. Those cases then trickled through to New South Wales and then some into Victoria. And in that particular situation, our Queensland colleagues weren't able to find the source. We certainly did a lot of testing here in New South Wales to try to find out what could be the source, and we couldn't. Likewise, it's not a food safety issue again, but African swine fever is finding its way all over the world. And again, it's, you know, edging its way to Australia. If it did find its way here, our whole pork industry would be decimated, as it has been in other countries. But again, it's trying to be prepared. We have limited capacity, fabulous, officers and staff who were authorised to act under the Food Act, authorised to act under the Biosecurity Act here in New South Wales, and on top of it, they're now also authorised to act under the Public Health Act. But it is a finite source. At present, we are certainly able to manage, but it is an issue if we were to get other multiple threats coming through. All I can say, it's very challenging.
Great stories there, Lisa, and well done keeping the show on the road. Previous comments about essential workers, I think also relates to food regulators, especially those on the ground. I'll come to you some other questions about the future and the opportunities when we get to the team chat later on, Lisa, so thanks very much for that. Alan, the People's Champion, the CEO of Choice. Alan Kirkland joined Choice in 2012, but before that he was involved in campaigning on issues as diverse as education funding, homelessness and public transport. He's also worked on the other side of the fence in government. As CEO of Legal Aid New South Wales during the GFC, Alan saw the human impact of poor lending practices, which sparked his passion for consumer rights. These days, Alan sees his job as making sure that Choice stays relevant to the needs of Australia's consumers, all the while having a little fun along the way. So just for our New Zealand viewers, Choice is the Australian equivalent of Consumer NZ. Alan, can you speak to us about what the whole consumer experience of this COVID-19 thing's been like, and how that's impacted Choice's business?
Yeah, I would start by saying I think that it's been an extraordinary period. If you think about the way in which people's habits have had to change just around food in a very short period of time, the way in which supply chains have changed, I think it's remarkable that we've come through that amount of change with confidence in the system without any serious crises in confidence. But to go to, I guess, what sort of happened for consumers, I mean, often in these discussions, my role is to provide a bit of a broader perspective, and and choices, of course, like Consumer NZ, best known for testing household appliances. And so I've done a bit of digging in terms of some of the data we have on that to give you a sense of some of the changes in behaviour that are, I think, relevant to food consumption. I'm just going to share my screen. And while I'm getting that up, I'll just explain what I'm about to show to you. What I've got, might take a little while to come through, but I've got some data here on Google Trends. So what this is data. It is Australian data, I should say, all of Australia, because it's a bit hard to show two countries in it, but the trends are broadly the same in New Zealand with a slightly different pattern over time. You've got 5 years of data here. You don't need to be able to read the small labels. Really what you need to look at is the shape over the line over 5 years. And the reason I've got 5 years is to give you a sense of how the last 6 months looks relative to that period, because it is quite extraordinary. What you've got here initially is the volume of searches on Google for coffee machines, any search term including coffee machines. I should also explain this data is an index. So the highest data point is a value of 100, which is the greatest search volume there's been across that 5 years, and every other value is relative to that. So if we look at coffee machines, right over on the right-hand side, you started to see a spike in late March, which is, of course, when restrictions started in Australia. The interesting thing is that it has remained significantly higher. So if we look right at the end of the graph, which is around the end of August, this last week, in fact, that is roughly double what the demand was at the same point last year. So this isn't just a lockdown reaction. People in Australia love their coffee and they're not prepared to miss out on it. And not only did they make sure they could make it at home once lockdown started, that behaviour has continued. And you see that continuing even in the States, where restrictions in Australia are currently less severe, such as in WA. I'll just give you another one. There's just a few of these to show you. This is Dutch ovens. I don't know if you use the same term in New Zealand, but those cast iron pans with a lid on them. Interesting in that you see, again, a really massive spike. In fact, it came a little bit later here, sort of late April into May was the big spike. But even when we get out to August, as at the end of August, it's getting warmer. It's still significantly higher than at the similar points in previous years. Why are people interested in Dutch ovens? There we go. It's due to this. It's an Instagram post on how to make your bread in a cast iron oven. This is actually a choice Instagram post, liked by 288 people, which is pretty significant for a sort of corporate account on Instagram. Just to further bear out that point, this is search demand for bread makers. So a little while into lockdown in Australia, people started to talk about making your own bread. There are a whole bunch of media articles about it that did really well, and we saw that play out through in a range of different ways. It obviously had an impact on supplies of flour as well. Again, even coming out the end of this period, similar pattern in that search demand is a lot higher than what would normally be at this time of year. So there is some sort of sustained effect there. And then just quickly, to show you a few others. Now, these are areas where you don't quite see the same pattern. This is freezers. You can see that massive spike there. That was 1 week right at the end of March when the lockdowns first started in Australia. The first thing people did was panic buy. The second thing they did was try to work out where to store all the fresh food that they'd bought. We've never seen a spike like this before, but demand for freezers, it was very much a one-off thing. It's settled back to more normal levels since then. And then another one that's had a lot of commentary where I think in some ways the data's a little bit surprising in that it's different to the to what a lot of the media commentary is saying. So this is search volume for Ubereats and for Deliveroo, the two main food delivery services in Australia. The interesting thing here is that there was definitely a spike late March into early April as lockdown started. But when you then look at what's happened since, it's kind of settled back to being similar to what the long-range trend was, as a gradual increase, but it's not extraordinary. So it seems that when it comes to home food delivery, there is a spike around lockdowns. And in fact, if I showed you the Victorian graph for the last few weeks, you'd see it's gone up again. But coming out of the extremity of lockdowns, it's sort of settling back to a normal pattern. Doesn't seem to be a sustained, extraordinary increase in people looking for food delivery services. So that's just, a bit of a story of what's happened in a few graphs. I think what to take from that, there was a strong and immediate reaction to lockdowns towards people ordering in more and making more things at home. Some of that was a reflexive reaction, and it kind of returned to normal levels in the months afterwards. But some of it has, at least this far in, 6 or so months in, led to a sustained change of behaviour. I think the interesting thing will be how much of that sticks into the future.
Thanks, Alan. That was very, very interesting. So, leads me on to a sort of a related question, and that is, back in March, we saw, and Catherine mentioned it, panic buying, the emptying of shelves of certain commodities. Catherine mentioned toilet paper, but certainly other commodities were affected as well. So, what's the story behind that from a consumer perspective? What's driving that?
Look, I think we have to understand it as a psychological reaction. What we know in times of crisis is that people tend to revert to patterns of behaviour. So in a situation like that, you tend to do what you did in the past. And in this situation, we didn't have any learned behaviour. So it was sort of pure psychology playing out. What happened was that it started with toilet paper. Toilet paper shortages started in some other parts of the world. It was a kind of interesting news story, and it bounced around the world. And in each market where you started to see stories about toilet paper running out in other parts of the world, then you started to get the same problem. And that's what happened in Australia. And obviously, it did also affect a number of food products. So, flour, pasta, all of those sort of staples were also an issue for a while. I think really what was happening was that people, in a time of enormous uncertainty, were trying to control what they could. The ability to put food on the plate, to have confidence they're going to be able to do that for more than the next few days, which might be the normal shopping cycle for some people, because they just didn't know how long this was going to last. And the news stories just sort of fueled more of that. I think that where we got it a little bit wrong, though, in terms of managing it, was that we, in a way, exacerbated that psychological reaction. So I think both supermarkets and the governments, being the key players in the debate at the time, really lost control of the message. In a way, the message was really focusing on the fact that things were selling out and that purchases were being restricted. There were limits on how many items you could buy. In a way, that reinforced that there was a problem that you needed to worry about as a person, that you might in fact find that you couldn't buy what you needed for your household or family. And I think that drove more panic buying in the short term. But I think, the good story is we did get on top of that relatively quickly. And certainly there were fears you might see that re-emerging in Victoria when the current restrictions were introduced a little while ago. But there was sort of a temporary reaction, but we didn't really seem to see those same problems in terms of supply chain. And certainly there were stories that was going to play out in other states in Australia as people saw those stories about it possibly happening in Victoria, and that didn't really seem to happen either. So I think it's a good story about about the system kind of really getting on top of the situation and now having much better sort of control about the supply chain issues, but also the way in which they're talking about those to consumers.
Fantastic. Alan, and I'll come to you later on what the future of food regulation can do for consumers. So thanks very much for that. Really, really interesting. I'll turn now to Professor Linda Tapsell from the University of Wollongong. Linda is a distinguished academic in medical and health sciences with discipline expertise in nutrition and dietetics. She's a fellow of both the Dietitians Association of Australia and the Nutrition Society of Australia, and in 2015 was recognised as a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to health science as an academic and clinician specialising in diet and nutrition. We certainly can't conduct a FSANZ event these days thinking about the future of food regulation, certainly without any comment on nutrition and the importance of that relative to the contribution or otherwise to chronic health conditions. So protecting public health and safety is what we're all about. And what does that mean, I guess, is a question. But specifically, Linda, what lessons can we learn from the agile public health response to COVID, and how can these be applied to food regulation to ensure the protection of both safety and public health?
Yes, thank you, Glenn. And gee, I really enjoyed the first three speakers, and was thinking, you know, we're all saying the same thing, but I'll say it from the public health perspective as well. I'm a bit of a silver linings person, so in some ways the thought that we pulled the jigsaw puzzle apart and we can build it again is kind of very exciting to me. I love the fact that food has come to the fore, that people are now taking food seriously, that it's seen as essential. You know, this has been missing for a long time, and that's good for every sector of the food playground, if you like. From a public health perspective, I think it's from the consumer's point of view, it has questioned their relationship with food. They've had to think about what they're buying. And then we've seen some data on how they've dealt with that. That's been really interesting. From the supply chain point of view, it has really pointed out the importance of all of those people who are involved in food production and delivery to the consumer. And of course, the food safety goes without saying. You know, the thought that it would even be questioned, is it essential, is something that's you know, very good, that's come out for us. I think from the public health perspective, what it has shown is that it's really quite critical in terms of how we get ourselves out of here as well. So naturally, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I've been reading New England Journal of Medicine constantly and trying to, you know, learn new things about the way viruses work and so on. Naturally, there was an immediate nutrition response to all of this. There's some great papers coming out on nutrition and immunity, but most importantly was the connection that was made between chronic disease and risk in association with infection. So while we've been bleating on for years about obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, how these are chronic epidemics within our society, they're not particularly, in some ways, the role of food is not taken particularly seriously. It has to now, because it's those particular chronic conditions that are putting people at high risk in terms of the outcomes of this disease. And I was speaking to my colleague who was associated with the science review from the American Dietary Guidelines. It's just come out. And of course, they'd written it all up in standard form, and then COVID hit. So immediately they had to put in a paragraph about it. And they're using this term, parallel synergistic epidemics. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an infectious epidemic, it's a pandemic of COVID-19, combined with a chronic epidemic of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. And so it's brought to the fore all the things that we need to be taking seriously in terms of public health and the implications for food. So big chance to do some wonderful things now, and lots of science behind why we should do it.
Fantastic. So how do you think, you know, you've read a lot already, you've mentioned that, and there's been some very interesting revelations. You call the two epidemics synergistic, but what, how do you think this event might perhaps shape the nutrition research agenda moving forward?
Well, the nutrition research agenda was moving along the lines of we need to be studying food and combinations of food more now than nutrients. And that's happened in, you know, there are 5 or 6 different publications that have come out lately stating the priorities for nutrition research. And of course, that also works well with the development of the food supply. The problem is we need to connect up more along both our chains of knowledge delivery and food innovation. Very often it's after the fact, or there are little pieces of information picked up and run off with new ideas. Those two need to work much more closely together from day one. So given that nutrition research is moving more now towards foods and dietary patterns, that's all the more reason now to be looking at a food platform, a food economy, if you like, that engages science from day one. I think one of the big lessons of COVID, one of the great things of COVID, particularly in Australia, was just how well science worked with government and industry and our local community, our population. We can do this with food too. This would be a fantastic thing.
Yeah, okay. Sounds very promising. So what are the thoughts about obesity and why those who are obese have been so badly affected by this particular virus?
Well, when you listen to a lot of the commentary on who's at greatest risk of COVID-19, you know, immediately you get the data on the older people. You get the death rates in the 80s and the 90s and, you know, even in the hundreds. Then you hear someone say under their breath, oh, and of course, it's not age if you suffer from chronic disease. And chronic disease is an epidemic in our community. So we shouldn't just be thinking it's the older people in our community that we need to protect. Certainly we do. And that's another story. But we do need to acknowledge that we have epidemic levels of chronic disease creeping up through all ages in our population. And that is going to mean that they are at greater risk of coming off worse in the COVID-19 situation. So all the more reason to take this issue of food and health seriously, because food is underpinning that situation.
So you're pretty optimistic that there's some real lessons learned out of this in terms of that collaboration, and I can just sense you're pretty excited. All the way from Wollongong, I can sense you're pretty excited about what the future may hold in terms of working together in this, right?
Yes, I think we're capable of it, and we just need the goodwill to do that.
Thank you, Linda. We'll come back, I'm sure, to some of those themes that you've raised. Peter Carter, the chap in charge of innovation at GS1. Now, GS1 is the company, connection of global companies that brings barcodes to us. Peter, you're a series of not-for-profit entities based at the country level, and people might be wondering what you're doing here, Peter. But sometimes, in terms of innovation sometimes can be about taking something that's working somewhere and applying it somewhere else. Is that the case, Peter? Would you agree with that?
Yes, thanks, Glenn. I think I'm in the right webinar to start with, but thank you for having me here. The relevance of GS1 here is, as a global standards body, non-for-profit, with an enormous industry membership. We play a role in assisting in moving information up and down the supply chain. So in Australia, we were already on our toes as a consequence of issues and events in the last few years around contamination and strawberries and listeria. And so industry has been very proactive. Awful series of events with, Catherine, to your point, with droughts and fires and then the current pandemic. But I think everyone had been focusing on issues around the effectiveness of existing supply chain models and significant issues around trust and risk, which we'll probably come to later in the conversation. So innovation has been a big topic of conversation for the last 24 months. And we've seen some really interesting things happen in supply chains recently. And I might just high level, just touch on these. Focus at the moment is everyone was concentrating on supply chain efficiency and optimization and doing more with less. And now we're in this situation where we're now really focusing on resilience. and what trade-offs have we made in the past to achieve greater levels of efficiency. So when a shock occurs, how does industry respond? And that's been a really, really valuable lesson. There's been lots of other lessons. I've jotted a few down. Actually, before I do that, I should call out, I think, a appreciation for the retailers, because I think, especially as it related to food, we saw some really proactive and constructive behaviour from the retail sector. And I think if they hadn't been proactive in the way they had been, we would have ended up with a much more complicated problem. The reason that toilet paper became a big focal point, I think, was back to the point about efficiency, is that per unit area in a supermarket, toilet paper is a very unprofitable line of business. Not only is it very expensive to move, because it's very low value per unit volume, the amount of space it takes up on a retail shelf is a really good metaphor almost for what we've all had to manage. So that's probably why it stood out. But what have we learned? I mean, every Australian and no doubt New Zealander has more recently learned how to use a QR code. Don't know how many times I did it last weekend between going to the coffee shop and a sporting event, but there's been some fundamental changes. So, and those changes won't roll back, I don't think. We were talking to major fashion retailers yesterday. Demand for business attire has just disappeared. This is the first time I've worn a tie for weeks. A real shift in e-commerce and last mile delivery. So goods being ordered and delivered to home, a monumental change. Customs and border security have struggled to manage the inbound movement of small parcel freight. So we've seen some really significant shifts, and some of these, Catherine and others, I hope we're sort of through the worst of it, but even seasonal labour and mobility of labour for the upcoming harvest of fruit and veg, I think we've got some real challenges still to navigate. It could actually get, could become more serious supply chain issues if we don't do that well. So it's nice to think that we're sort of through it. But I think, back to your point, Len, there's been huge focus on technology and innovation and new ideas. But during times of crisis, it's the consistent application of simple methods that work well that have proven really important at this time.
So, Peter, when we met about a week ago via Zoom, you talked to me, you were talking about New Zealand in terms of recent successes it's had in terms of that cross-border transactions, something called e-phyto. What's all that about? So
New Zealand's a great international use case for the application of global data standards for trade. So every business in New Zealand has a business number, which is actually a GS1 identifier. And that from GoGet allows the New Zealand business to interact with global business partners using the same language. So like business location identifiers, product identifiers, the universal keys that help convey information about products moving through the supply chain. New Zealand's one of the world leaders as far as that's concerned. And that makes it very easy for New Zealand government and industry to say, well, let's eliminate some manual processes like manual declarations of e-phyto clearance certificates. Now, those certificates are probably more important in some cases than an invoice, because funds don't typically move until there's evidence of phytosanitary clearance. So the automation of business processes is creating new opportunities, and particularly new opportunities for regulators, because it's demonstrating that we can significantly improve the compliance and also reduce the cost of providing system integrity for government at the same time. And that's putting a lot of focus on good quality data and application of standards, which is, again, something we might talk about later around the future of regulatory automation for government.
Yeah. So you can see one of the challenges we face and we're very aware of when it comes to setting food standards, particularly labelling requirements, Peter, is that there's not much room, there's not much real estate sort of left on a food label. So do you see potentially there being an opportunity for QR codes to step in and play a role here in terms of getting information across to consumers in a more efficient manner, perhaps?
There's some really exciting changes coming. I should call out, we're right in the middle of a review of country of origin labelling in Australia, so it's very topical for us. Brand owners, product manufacturers internationally would like to see fewer codes on their packs, and there's actually a new standard that GS1 have only just ratified, getting to your point around whether it's a QR code or a data matrix or a zebra stripe traditional barcode or an RFID, is it doesn't actually matter anymore. So as of January, some new standards have been implemented that allow any standard-based product identifier to direct information to the user. It might be a customer or someone in the supply chain that scans. So it's no longer really a question about the symbology. Is the future will involve you using any type of standards-based identifier to be able to perform the function of the other, which is a really great step forward because it means that industry doesn't have to retool and put a new type of code on pack. If you want to link to a website, then the future will involve consumers being able to do that through their standard existing barcode. If they want more information, you will have seen recently Woolworths started implementing data embedded codes on product, which is a fantastic development for consumers and public health because it means that use by dates and down to serialization such that we can get full traceability and proof of origin, that data is now being incorporated into the symbols that are being that are on packaging in supermarket shelves. And that's stopping retailers automatically at point of sale selling something that may be unsafe. And it's sort of a small step for mankind, but it's fundamentally a good move and it's just the beginning. So we're seeing the digitization of supply chains and it's an exciting time. And matching what industry is doing and what government is doing is probably the challenge. Wonderful time for FSANZ to be modernising and looking at the future because if we can align what industry is doing and what government does and deliver efficiency and cost savings and improvements, that's good for everyone.
Peter, thanks very much for sharing that. I just want to, before we go to a couple of Q&A questions that have come through on diets and food waste, just remind people that if you have a question, just stick it in there. But Alan, do you see that QR codes, consumers have been warmed up to those? They see a point and a purpose to them now. They see a benefit to them. Do you think that Australian and New Zealand consumers are ready for QR codes?
It's interesting. I mean, I remember reading a bunch of articles and probably even saying myself sort of 8 or 10 years ago that QR codes were dead. I would never have guessed that they'd be something that, I've already used at least one today, which tells you about my path to work. I think that when it comes to labelling and what should go in front of pack versus, what is something that you would allow somebody to access through something like a QR code, it really comes down to how important it is. So as a policy decision, we've decided that there is something that is so important that most people want to know it, and they want to know it quickly when they're in the grocery aisle, then I think there's a strong case for it going on pack. And that's why we've consistently supported country of origin labelling in Australia, and also things like the Health Star Rating scheme. I think that where things like QR codes have a role is for that additional information that is of interest to some groups of consumers. Because in reality, I mean, if you think, that process of scanning a QR code every time you go to sit down to have a coffee somewhere, in the places where you're able to do that at the moment, if you want to do that with every product that you consider putting in your shopping trolley, or even the 2 or 3 you're considering within a category in the supermarket aisle, it's just not realistic. So I think it's a solution for highly engaged consumers who have particular interests or needs. I don't think it's a solution for those sort of labelling needs that we think are of interest or important to a large section of the community.
Great. Okay, we'll take a couple of questions off the Q&A, but then we're going to go to the panellists and see if they've got any questions or comments for each other. So that's going to be something to look forward to. So the first question, I think Catherine is going to take, and it's about how has food waste changed over the past 6 months, Catherine?
Well, this has probably been one of the unwritten stories about the COVID response here. There has been massive food waste because, of course, you had every single restaurant with fresh produce having to either find somewhere to donate their product, or unfortunately quite a lot went to landfill. And as most, or probably all of the callers know, when you are producing food, it tends to come in waves. So you have week by week more pork, chicken, seafood, milk, etc. And a lot of that food is not sold through supermarkets. So supermarkets and convenience stores were the only retailers remaining open. And of course, everything else had to find where to go. So we had quite a few near misses when it came to food waste. We had 5,000 pigs with nowhere to go, but thanks to the Ministry of Primary Industries, processing was found and that was donated to New Zealand food banks. There was a lot that we learnt about trying to minimise food waste, but unfortunately, Glenn, I think some of the real challenges are still ahead of us for producers, and that is not really in the food waste space, but what to do about those 300,000 mouths that you referenced. Many of those would travel the country picking fruit and having roles in food production up and down New Zealand. And unfortunately, we now have some apple growers worrying about whether or not they're going to have a next season at all, because they don't believe that sufficient New Zealanders will step up. We have 2 of our major fishing companies thinking of parking their fleets because they can't get their expertise in. And we also have a few of our food companies who are either delaying or putting off major installations of manufacturing and kit because, of course, they can't get people into the country to be able to do those installations. So we do have a very strict lockdown, and New Zealanders will often describe ourselves as being part of a team of 5 million, but we also have a lot of expertise that is not here currently in the team that we rely on. We rely on these people coming to New Zealand and playing their part. So, it certainly is a challenging time.
Thanks, Catherine. Very interesting. Question for Linda Tapsell. What's happened to our diets? What's happened to the way we feed ourselves? What's happened to nutrition? How have we looked after ourselves, particularly during the more severe end of the lockdowns? You're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Well, we'll only have anecdotal stuff on that until we do proper surveys, which has to be part of our infrastructure for public health nutrition. But certainly the issue of overeating and drinking alcohol is a reasonable concern. That, of course, goes to the mental health of the population, and therefore you can see why it's so important to have had all of those mental health supportive strategies that have been in operation. it also underlines how you can't isolate food from so many other things in society, and food behaviour from so many other things in society, which is why we need a broader approach to how we're addressing food in the future in the country, hence this idea of the jigsaw puzzle and how does it all fit in. So yes, I acknowledge people have probably overeaten and drunk a lot of alcohol during this time too, probably tied to this circumstance.
Moderation sometimes, but
yeah.
Lisa, can I turn to you now? Is there any question, Lisa, that you have for any of the other panelists about anything you've heard so far? Or shall I put some more questions to you? Your choice.
I had a thought listening to Alan, and when he was responding to your question about QR codes. So, Alan, may not be a question directed to you, but perhaps just to get a little bit of future thinking going on. Was mulling over in my mind last night about the smart shopping trolley of the future. So some of my colleagues in the broader department that I belong to have thought about the smart shopping trolley from the point of view of if you're physically in the store, adding things to your shopping trolley that, you as you leave the store, you automatically get charged for them. None of this stopping at the counter, having to unload, reload, etc. And I thought, well, I wonder if you could take that a little step further and say, we are all individuals, we're interested in different things about food. What if, for example, and I'm not, but if I had people in my household who suffered from food intolerances and allergies, what if I had a personalised algorithm that any time that I added something into my shopping trolley, be that a physical one or be that a virtual one online, it would send me a message and it would say, you've just added something that potentially contains an allergen that you're concerned about. Are you sure you want to go down this path? Similarly, if I received advice from my doctor, I took it upon myself to say, I need to look carefully at the amount of saturated fats that I'm eating, the salts that I'm eating, how much sugar am I ingesting. I could tap that away into my own personal algorithm, and as I'm adding things into my shopping trolley, my little algorithm can tell me, oh, hang on, you've told me one thing and you're behaving in a different way. So I guess that's something that I wanted to put out to, is that a future that we're looking at to help us, to have technology help us change our behaviours? Because certainly I think what the whole pandemic has showed us is that people can change behaviours. We have changed our behaviours, and if you're in Australia and New Zealand, we are all benefiting from that because the pandemic has been managed very well.
Yeah, I agree. And look, when it comes to nutrition, a lot of people want to change behaviours as well. It's just often really, really hard. And I would say, I can absolutely see that happening. Besides the examples you mentioned, the idea of being able to set a kind of minimum number of health stars on the trolley so it sets off an alarm every time the kids throw in something that's got less than that would be something a lot of parents would value, I think. And I can see us getting there because I think
your smart trolley might make you push it all the way home.
That's right. Yeah, could program you for exercise too. Could build in bumps like you have on the treadmill. I think ultimately there may be incentives for the supermarkets to do this. I think the major supermarket chains in Australia have played a really important role in helping us to get things like the Health Star Rating scheme, because they've recognised that it was something that consumers valued. They've led the way in getting health stars on many of their private label products. And I think for similar reasons, you might over time see them building features into their apps for online shopping. And ultimately, if we end up with smart trolleys in store that actually simplify those choices that they know that many of their customers actually want to make.
Can I just comment on that? It's another thought that I've often had, that part of doing things differently now is, couldn't we take a position on designing the supply rather than just depending on demand to create the food supply, the future food supply? that a lot more could go into that. We've got all this smart technology, we've got all this data, we've got all this ability. We could work on what should our food supply look like, what should be in the supermarket, rather than here it is now, you choose, you know, what's best for you and watch out if you choose wrong, sort of thing.
And if, retailers are thinking very hard. We've all signed up to our member programs and our reward systems. I would like to see a future where those programs are being used for public good. I think, Lisa, at the risk, Glenn, of taking the conversation in a interesting path, is that I look forward to a future where perhaps retail centres are healthy living centres. So, and they are actually probably focused on public health outcomes as much as they are shareholder returns. And I think it costs you in Australia, public health, I think, is around $180 to $200 billion a year government headline. So there is actually a real opportunity and commercial benefit for food retailers in particular to concentrate on public health outcomes. And we don't tend to have those conversations at the moment. Maybe COVID might take us there.
Catherine, what do you make of all this?
It's an interesting comment, and if you look at the way the supermarkets conduct their business both in Australia and New Zealand, the first thing that a consumer will see as they walk in is that wonderful array of fresh fruit and vegetables. The whole model of a supermarket is that all Kiwis and Aussies can go in and put in their trolley things that they know that their families will enjoy. One of the things we have seen during COVID is that while people aren't able to go on family holidays or do all sorts of other things, they have been resorting to those small indulgences, those chocolate biscuits and the confectionery and, as well as the other stuff. I think COVID has been wonderful, if there is a wonderful aspect, in that it has got people back into thinking about cooking from scratch. And when you look at some of the products that we did struggle to keep on the shelf, although we managed to do it, a lot of baking, a lot of vegetables, meat, and I think people have found that love of cooking again. And to go back to a point that Ellen made in terms of biobehaviour, we're all hoping that does stick, and that takes weeks to develop a habit, but hopefully there are more people enjoying food from supermarkets. It's not great if you're a restaurant or a takeaway spot, but I think it's best that families get back into that old-fashioned sitting around a table, chewing, having conversations. I was almost going to say chew the fat. I thought, no, that's not what I meant. And I think that has been a very positive thing. Families have enjoyed spending that time together.
Fantastic. So yeah, Lisa, what's intriguing concept, this smart trolley? Do you see a role for New South Wales Food Authority or the regulator of the future in underpinning this relationship between a person's trolley and their diet?
Hard to say if it's the role of the regulator to do that or where the drive will come from. But again, it is a way of looking at how can we use the technology that's available to us, look in the future and see how we all need a bit of a nudge to change our behaviours. So, what are the nudges to get us moving towards a healthier diet?
Indeed.
And making healthier choices.
Glenn, I have a question for Lisa. Lisa, you pointed out that you had a very important role in assuring consumers about the safety of packaged foods, i.e. whether or not coronavirus could be carried by packaging. It sounded to me that you were very confident in your affirmation of that. Here in New Zealand, we had questions raised and we had days and days of media coverage about frozen foods and whether it was on packaging. No, I would have thought these were things that food safety experts could answer quite quickly. Or was there, did you have to go back, or was it something you already knew?
When I talked about it earlier, it was whether food itself would be the vehicle for transmission. So I wasn't talking so much about the packaging, but likewise in Australia, there's been a lot of interest around the packaging. You know, we hear reports, whether they're correct or not, coming out that China, for example, has been doing a large amount of testing of the packaging of foods, different trading partners asking people to certify that, you know, they're COVID-free, including the packaging, etc. But I really don't think that the studies, well, some of the studies are there that suggest that the virus can remain in the environment for a long period of time. But many of those studies, the tests that they're using is it's a molecular test. So it says that the virus was present at some point. It doesn't tell us, you know, is the virus actually infectious, and is the virus there in a high enough level to cause infection, if indeed it is a live virus that we're dealing with. And again, I only see the media reports as well of supposedly hundreds of thousands of products being swabbed and tested, and a handful coming back with these positives. So up front, that issue of survival of the virus on the packaging wasn't as obvious, but the issue of whether the food itself, whether people were becoming ill through consuming the food, that was quite a clear decision-making point. And we had to learn a lot more about the virus itself to understand how does it behave in the environment, and indeed how is it behaving in its transmission between people.
I noticed the International Commission on the Microbiological Safety of Food last Thursday published a fairly authoritative piece on essentially the importance or relative importance of that transmission route, concluding that there's really nothing to see here. The reason to point out, Lisa, the presence of the virus, or at least the presence of virus particles when it was once alive, is difficult to quantify from a disease transmission risk perspective, and you know it's a bit of a mouthful. It's a relatively difficult concept to grasp, isn't it? Especially at a time when it seems like countries are just looking for opportunities to change the trading profile of imports and exports. So, yeah, pleased to see that the science seems to be settling on that one, though. Any questions from the audience that we want to pick up on? I'll just remind panellists that to have a look through those, and feel free to sing out if you would like to take any of those on.
Len, a question for the food experts on the panel, please, is one of the observations I've been making recently, particularly when we've talked about food traceability and the need for more disclosures or more regulation or less in some cases, is what can we take from the pharmaceutical industry, where over recent decades there's been quite effective regulatory frameworks put in place for some product lines. Are we reinventing things for the food industry that we could simply adapt from other industries to improve supply chain performance?
Good question, Peter. Catherine, what can we take from the pharmaceutical sector?
Well, we can, in terms of food safety and adherence to regulations, I think that there's a lot for all food manufacturers to take out of the pharmaceutical industry. I just recently visited a couple of manufacturing facilities in Auckland at the beginning of the year, and even though they're manufacturing food, they have established their new factory to a pharmaceutical level. And I think that's going to be the way forward, because particularly when you've got countries like China, as Lisa alluded to before, saying that they, that they're going to deny entry to products if a staff member has been, suffered from COVID, etc., or any kind of food safety issue. We need to make sure that we are absolutely doing all we can to go over and above what the regulations expect us to do. And I think that most professional food companies do try and over deliver and not just meet the regulation, rather developing a food safety culture.
Yeah. Interesting. Sonia, anything from the audience that we want to pick up on, perhaps? Just while we're on that, Alan, what do you make of the difference between the pharmaceutical sector and the consumer experience of food? Do you think that it's possible to regulate pills and potions in the same way that we regulate the joyously diverse food industry that we get to enjoy on a regular basis? And we're all looking forward to getting back into the food service sector, of course, once it opens again in all areas. But do you think there's anything that we can take from that area?
I mean, I think when it comes to the properly regulated pharmaceutical sector, obviously we're dealing with different types of risk, and also regulation is also tied in with government subsidies of types of medications. So you've got different policy drivers there. What I think continues to be really interesting is the products that live in the grey zones. So the kind of food-related products that are marketed as having health benefits that manage to get around the regulation that seeks to, limit the use of health claims in food marketing. I think in a time like this, when people are spending more time online, many people are spending time in kind of relatively closed sort of social communities online. There's a lot more opportunity for sort of falsehoods about the health benefits of food to circulate. And I think we'll need to be thinking a lot harder around whether the sort of boundaries between the sort of health regulation and the food regulation systems are actually working effectively to protect consumers. I think that there's room to do a bit more work and thinking in that space.
Indeed. Difficult. The barcode of cabbage is.
Glenn, I'll just, if you can, I'm going to throw a question to Linda that's come in from the audience, but I'm going to also combine it with something else that was raised about the issue about technology in trolleys, and it's about behaviour change, Linda, and it's about your point about changing the food supply through regulation. So the question from the audience is, what would be the easiest regulatory measures to shift the overall characteristics of the food supply towards diets that benefit health? But I wanted to combine that with the question around how can we use technology to shape behaviour? Because as we know, in the public health nutrition space, it's been very difficult to change behaviours through a range of mechanisms. So what do these new opportunities potentially provide us with in that space?
I'm clicking the wrong unmute thing. One of the issues I want to get across is, often when we talk about public health nutrition and nutrition strategies, is we tend to oversimplify something that is very, very complex. And so the challenge that we have is in communicating nutrition science so that people understand it, as well as they appear to have understood immunology in the last 6 months, because nutrition science is that complex. And it goes back to understanding how key nutrients can be found in some of those pathways that you'll see in some of those diagrams of viruses and T cells and things coming in. There's nutrition elements in there that are part of that play. The issue is not just knowing that, it's understanding how does that translate to practice. And what very often happens in commercializing that knowledge is a big jump has gone, oh, we've seen zinc in here, so we need zinc fortified foods and so on. So we need a regulatory system that is very strong on science, That's the first thing. So that we've got systems that we can integrate the knowledge of science in such a way that it delivers something that is useful to the food economy at the end of the day. We have come down with simple messages, you know, vegetables and fruits and so on, but I can tell you the science around those areas is just phenomenal at the moment, the way they are analysing the components of those different foods, that our understanding of food is becoming very, very complex and sophisticated and potentially very useful for public health. So I think let's not oversimplify what this is and make sure that there is a very strong nutrition science base in anything we do in developing further regulatory standards. And that includes the ability to distill and integrate scientific knowledge in a way that delivers useful outcomes. Does that make sense? Should I show my slide? One of the things that I did want to share was, let's see if I can do it, my slide on...
yes, on speak.
Is it coming up? Is on...
Yep, here it comes.
Got it? So what I did, one of the things I did was look at some of the big institutes that have done nutrition research priorities in the future. So the Australian Academy of Science last year, I've just done this by timelines, identified that we needed to look at everyone's saying dietary patterns, everyone's saying it's the total diet that counts. So while we focus on single nutrients and single foods, we do know that the impact metabolically on the body is the total diet. And that's why it's so complicated, because we have to have ways and means of being able to position individual foods and individual nutrients within that global outcome. There's a lot of science looking at nutrition mechanisms, and the National Institutes of Health have got that down as well, fundamental research. So that's all the biology side of it, which of course is very fascinating, but you need to be very careful how you interpret that through the supply chain. Precision nutrition, that's your supermarket trolley again. So I'm glad you brought that up, Lisa. This is on the way. So there's lots of things that can be delivered through nutrition science. Food as medicine is the same as well. So there are a number of documents now that are directing nutrition science and will set the priorities. But as I said in our next slide, is that one going to come up? This COVID disruptor is something that has really got us thinking. So now perhaps we need to think how do we develop a food economy that best works within our current epidemics. So I'll stop sharing now. So I answered all of those questions in one.
You did. Thank you very much. In asking all of the panellists another question, I wanted to hark back to Linda's point about the jigsaw puzzle and, you know, the many parts of a jigsaw puzzle that food is. And, you know, it goes across many portfolio areas in government. It cuts across, you know, government, private sector, non-government. It's wide ranging. So one of the things that one of our board members has actually asked about, Roscoe Taylor, is there any appetite amongst yourselves and the broader community for the development of a food and nutrition policy to provide that overarching piece that is currently, you know, arguably missing?
Well, here in New Zealand, we have the National Nutrition Guidelines, which are widely supported by the food industry, and many of our major firms underpins a lot of their new product development. And some of the comments that Linda made reminded me of the part that the food industry has played, and we do look at always at what more can be done. But certainly over the last 10 years, there's been significant amount of reformulation to reduce salt, sugar, fat, etc. And one of the things we have learned is that first and foremost, you can never compromise taste. because we also, although some of our firms tried to do the right thing and launch new products which have all the right components and attributes, consumers have said, oh, I don't like it, I'm not going to buy it again. So that has always been a challenge. There have been other things like reducing portion size of treat foods and introducing share packs. And interestingly, when we do that, when we reduce the size of chocolate bars or put fewer biscuits in a pack, quite often that will come with a bad news story, because some will comment and say, oh, well, you're just shortchanging me, as opposed to trying to get people into eating less, moving more, and thinking about having that nutrition education that Linda was referring to. It's, it's supposed to be covered in the curriculum of all our schools, and we're supposed to all know this stuff, but it's really interesting that so many adults don't have that basic understanding that food is definitely medicine.
Your thoughts on that, Linda?
The ideas of food sustainability and food security into that broader jigsaw.
Yes, that's the food as medicine and the food sustainability is a big issue, and it does mean now that we need to get smarter about integrating different forms of knowledge in being able to determine what are the foods that really count now. That's what we're getting down to. What are the foods that we should really be focusing on, and being prepared to let go of some things too, that things that we did in the 80s and 90s, we might know something better now, because that's the nature of science. It moves on. We get better at measuring things. We get better at studying things. We debate all the time amongst each other. And it's not about scientists changing their minds. It's about scientists understanding what they're looking at a lot better. So we need to keep this parallel relationship, and it needs to be very strong. And then, of course, we do need to, as you say, the nutrition education is important, but we need to reinvigorate that somehow as well, so that it's not just being able to recite the 5 food groups anymore. It's actually really understanding what we're talking about, which is it's giving you the best chance at life, really.
Very good. Very good. Great question. Couple of questions there. Thanks, Sonia. I'll keep you occupied on the Q&A there from the audience. Linda, you talked about essentially a renaissance of science, if you like, and a renaissance in public health that we've undergone in the last 6 months, and you're optimistic about where that might take us. I think we've also touched on this with Lisa's talk about a renaissance in terms of working together, and that brings a certain level of optimism. But Lisa, I might turn to you. Do you think there's been any other sort of unexpected opportunities that have arisen in the last 6 months?
When we're having the discussion before about nutrition and getting the public more familiar with that terminology, I think that what the last 6 months have shown us is that many people have grown familiar with terms that they would not ever have heard of before, and that's, infectious disease and epidemiological speak, so to speak. The flattening of the curve. What's a cluster? Contact tracing, and the whole genome sequencing. We hear about that on a daily basis, where we have our public health officials out there giving people confidence that we can see the linkages, we know where it comes from, very open as well when they find it very difficult to trace it back to a particular group. So I think that tells us very clearly that the public can change behaviour, and they change behaviour very quickly, and they actually, can get some of this very, technical terminology. It can be delivered to them in a way that it can be understood. So I think that's a great thing, a great positive to get out of it. I know that sort of with COVID, there's been a huge focus on cleaning and sanitation and hygiene as a whole. When we've had to look at foodborne disease outbreaks, for example, there's sort of some of the common elements that we see that we get failures in. So there's a hidden hope there that it's also going to, bode well for good practices when it comes to food safety. And adaptation, we've seen people who are making gin turn to making sanitizers for us, which is, just terrific. We talked previously about how well the industry, adapted to the food, the surge in demand for products, and the food industry needs to be broadly congratulated for all of that. I know of food businesses having to change their model. Those who had a very diverse model to begin with are faring better through the pandemic. Others, I suppose, when you look at restaurants that were purely dine-in, have adapted to try to have takeaway. That can be a struggle and perhaps not a long-term solution. But there's entire industry sectors, and I'll call out the oyster industry as one. They've always known it was a risk for them. Their base in Australia is predominantly domestic and hospitality, and that went. So now they're looking at themselves and saying, okay, how can I break into a retail market? What are the expectations of a retailer? How can I break into more export? A number of our harvest areas are export certified. Few are actually doing export. And again, looking and trying to understand what are the expectations of importing nations. Through the Food Agility CRC, there was a project running looking at remote sensing, which is the way in oyster harvest areas where you get the safety and the certainty that it's okay to harvest. And again, that's a technology, a real-time technology that a lot of this industry are looking at and going, well, okay, an importing nation will want me to demonstrate very quickly and clearly that my product is safe, and there's a technology and an existing technology that can do that. So they're just sort of some of my thoughts on the unexpected opportunities. And of course, we're all in a Zoom format now, and, the whole digital collaboration has, I think we've all been surprised as to how quickly we've been able to adapt to it. Perhaps the catchphrase is also, you're on mute. But it's been terrific, and we all need to consider, in the future, how are we going to blend this way of operating together with how we were operating previously. I know that for ourselves, when we are running training courses, for example, we have a strong partnership with local government. We provide training and guidance to them. Face-to-face, you might be able to get, 20 to 30 people together from across the state. We've repeatedly got 250 coming to these things because people don't have to travel. They can sit in their office and do it, or sit from home and do it. And even this webinar is an example. We had over 800 registrants. You wouldn't have got necessarily 800 people coming somewhere across two nations for a couple of hours. So it's something that, the digital collaboration will be used moving forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa. Come to the others with what they see as being the one big opportunity in a moment, and then we'll round it off with the big question, which is, in light of the modernisation agenda, what should food regulators be doing more of, less of, or differently, perhaps? We've heard a little bit about that already, but Sonia, you have a question, I understand. Are you there, Sonia? You're on mute.
Yeah. No, she's looking down. Glenn, if I might just comment, there's quite a few questions here about snake oil salesmen and protecting the consumer about false claims and so on. And of course, this is this is very real in the sense that, the same as turning up about COVID-19 as well. So we wouldn't be surprised that somebody might pick up on that on food as well. So yes, I think the Food Standards Agency has a huge role, and so do the public health agencies in protecting consumers against that.
Yeah.
I think that needs to be said, yes.
Yeah, rest assured, when there's some vigilance made around that sort of thing, and come on that as well. Sonia.
Thanks, Glenn. I wanted to turn to some of the comments that have been made about the workforce and disruptions to the workforce and the way that the workforce has had to quickly adapt and some of the impacts that we've seen on that. So we've seen changes to remote working, as we've said. We've seen losses of roles, but new roles are rising. But overall, it's been about adaptability of the workforce and how we deal with that. So in terms of food scientists and food regulatory experts and experts across the whole food sector, what do you think this means for the capability in those areas going forward? So Lisa, perhaps I turn to you to start with, and then perhaps Catherine as well.
As I had mentioned earlier on, in terms of our own workforce, we have the directive, if you can work from home, do so. But obviously a lot of our work requires us to go out and to be face-to-face with people. For those who are working from home, it's fair to say that, many have enjoyed the experience. It's potentially saved them time that they would have otherwise have spent in traffic. Or has reduced their travel just going to different meetings. Others are fatigued by it, can feel isolated, and I think particularly when we had situations where you had multiple people working from home and also having to homeschool, that was testing for many individuals, and it's fair to say that there are some people who are not okay. And that reminds me, today in Australia, I'm not sure if it also is in New Zealand, or is Are You OK Day, where we take the opportunity to reach out to others where we have seen some slight behaviour change and we feel that they are struggling. And no better time than during COVID for us to do that, and a difficulty when a lot of us aren't face-to-face, to be able to pick up on those small nuances that can be the start of a very important conversation. Sorry, I digressed into another area, but from a regulatory perspective, we actually have, been doing desktop audits where we haven't been able to go there in person, or we chose for a short period of time not to go there. And I think that really is one space in terms of the virtual audit or the remote audit that will be coming in the future. I mentioned the Food Agility CRC earlier on, and I'm aware that there's another project concept within that specifically around this, where it's the use of smart glasses technology, which might, someone wears, walks around an actual plant, but the actual auditor isn't wearing them. The actual auditor is somewhere remotely, and having to have the skill to be able to interpret what that person is seeing. In the future, it might be a robot that travels around a food factory. So they're things that are very real and are being progressed, and with technology that is currently available. Of course, food factories are notorious to having lots of little dark corners where your Wi-Fi doesn't quite reach, but that's another one that has to be resolved. So in terms of, the regulatory space, yes, certainly you can see that aspect of virtual auditing having a role. And, Peter mentioned earlier, of course, the whole traceability issue, being able to trace product literally from farm through to someone's plate.
I think Lisa makes a really good point about the rise in productivity, and also issues I think we all need to be aware of about mental health, people who are not engaging with one another. And in our office at FGC, we've had a chat about, Zoom's been good for catch-ups, but there's no substitute for the over the water cooler, just bump into someone's office to have a chat as it arises. I've always been a bit old school, and referenced working from home and inverted commas, and I realised I was 100% wrong. And having to do it, I realised it is an opportunity to be more productive. There is a greater tiredness because staring at yourself and your colleagues at Zoom all day does seem to me more tiring than attending meetings in person. But look, I think we've got to take the best bits of it. We've got to learn from some of our mistakes. And unfortunately, because I think COVID's going to be with us for quite some time, we're going to have to learn to live with it for 12 months to a couple of years. And the final thing I'd say is that there are some workers that cannot stay at home. Your machinery operators, your manufacturing engineers, your electricians, your boiler makers, etc. To go back to a point I made at the beginning, that's why we need them to be able to travel freely, because they're parts of our puzzle that can completely shut down lines and reduce production when they have to stay home.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So Sonia, one last question we have time for, and then we'll ask the panel about that one big opportunity, and then finish up with your summary. So one last question I think you have there, Sonia.
So one last question. I'm going to turn to a question from one of our other board members, Mark Lawrence. And Mark raises the issue of environmental sustainability. And so related to the previous question I asked about looking broadly at the system, the food system, food plays a great part in environmental sustainability. So the question is around what role the food regulatory system can play in protecting food and nutrition security. I think as a final question, you could all provide some closing thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, of course, I acknowledge that definitely with markets at the forefront of nutrition science, considering that particular issue. And again, it's one of those integrative areas where we need to be looking at this conceptualization of what the food supply should look like when we take in all of those parameters. And that's not to say an economic one isn't in there as well, it is, but the environment and sustainability has to be a significant driver.
And just to answer that in another way, and noting another question that was in from the audience as well, which was actually around packaging waste. I mean, I do think that undoubtedly there's been an increase in packaging going into landfill. That's due to businesses being understandably risk averse in the current context, so not allowing reusable containers. Also the increase in home delivery and takeaway. But I do think that if we have to live in something like the current state for a sustained period of time, then we do need to think about how we facilitate businesses to be actually reducing the amount of waste that comes from the products that they're providing. I mean, a number of the sort of single-use plastic type initiatives have sort of been put on hold because of this crisis. I think that's okay for now, but as we get a sense of how long this is likely to continue and also a better understanding of the science, I think the regulatory system needs to be giving businesses a sense of where the true risks are, so that businesses do have a sense of where they can be helping their customers to make more sustainable choices in terms of reducing waste.
That's a really good point, Ellen, and we hear consumers loud and clear. And you're also right that we did take a bit of a backward step during COVID, putting more packaging on fruit and vegetables during the first lockdowns, because both our supermarkets here had initiatives which were, in one instance, called Food in the Nude, going, getting rid of plastic, etc. But I'm glad that they've moved forward and got back into that. And it was the same with keep cups, with takeaways and cafes and things. They started declining those, and really we've got to make sure that we're moving forward and making sure that we're reducing the amount that we send to landfill. And that's something that certainly the Food and Grocery Council was very active on. We've got four different working groups looking at plastics, paper, compostability, etc. Because you are absolutely right. Consumers are asking that about this every day, and we hear them loud and clear.
And if I may, I might tackle your question too, given time, around the opportunity that the current situation's created. Is it around sustainability? Look, five years ago, I don't think anyone really thought we were going to end up with barcodes on our fresh produce. And the implications that simple thing, and I don't want to be taken out of context here, that's just an example of what we can do.
Yeah.
The impact that's had on retailers, when people previously have been scanning their, kiwi fruit, expensive kiwi fruit as sweet potato, in order to get that had a compiling effect, because not only were the retailers ordering more of the product that they couldn't sell, I think we should take stock of the good things that have happened and learn from that so we can apply it. I think the COVID situation, unfortunately, one of the big lessons we're learning is that it's possibly preparing us for much worse situations. Without overthinking it, a regional shipping interruption would be a really big supply chain disruption for us. So we are learning through COVID the importance of hardening our supply chains, and we're making really good progress. All of the pointers are saying that we need science to underpin the strategy that we implement, and we need quality data. And that's where the GS1 relevance comes into this, is that we can't construct good policy without good information based on scientific, valid approaches. But we do need to do this, because COVID is teaching us that something that's completely outside of our control, and in the scheme of things, history might say it was relatively minor, but there are much more significant disruptions that we may have to navigate in the next 10 years. And hopefully we come out of this, and through a FSANZ modernisation process as well, with a really robust supply chain system for food that's safe and that's secure.
Very nicely put, Peter. Thank you. One last thought from you, Lisa.
Well, I guess I'll continue on the waste theme a little bit as well, but not so much talk about the packaging side of it. Of course, there's always been a lot of interest in edible packaging, so that you move towards a zero waste scenario. But, we have to recognise that, we have droughts in this country. I mean, water is a key issue for Australia, and we need to be open to looking at more reclaimed water use. We have to look at some of the current byproducts of food manufacture, and whether you can actually extract from that some very high value ingredients such as proteins. Land use waste. Varying different jurisdictions try to get people to go down a composting path. And again, that has its risks, whether it's biosecurity or food safety, but we do generate a lot of waste. We need to be considering how can we reuse that waste safely, and that whole recycling of animal and food waste more broadly. That's my 2 cents worth on zero waste. But the other opportunities, of course, is the concept of having food production anywhere and any time. Urban farming, vertical agriculture, using existing technologies that we know, like genetic modification. What if we do produce that chicken that is Campylobacter free and Salmonella free? Would the public then, be more accepting of those sort of technologies? We currently have before, FSANZ. Actually, it's not before FSANZ, but we know that it's about the place. The concept of slaughterless meat production. Lab-grown meat. So there are the things that are out there that we as regulators need to be aware of and we need to be looking and considering, how we're going to accommodate these new technologies and these foods into the regulatory system, so that that they are safe for consumers.
Right. Sonia, your 2-minute summary.
2 minutes. I thought I had 10. Okay, I have the unenviable task of trying to draw some threads between what everyone has said. First of all, let me thank you all. This has been a great conversation and you've covered so much ground. So I'm going to try and bookend how Glenn started in talking about opportunity. Opportunity is the thread that has run through this. And in doing that, I'm going to quote Winston Churchill, who said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And I think that really summarises what we've been dealing with at large globally and what we're talking about now in terms of the food system and food regulation. We've seen, this major disruption, and I've just been reflecting now that often when we see a shock to the food system, it's short and sharp. But COVID has provided us this opportunity almost to have this sustained shock that has really ended up creating large-scale and long-lasting. I think some of this will be long-lasting change. So that's, I guess, the first thing. I think the second thing I would say is that a couple of you have mentioned how, whilst we've seen this disruption, the system has fared very well. Both from a regulatory perspective, a supply chain perspective, and Alan spoke about the fact that, we've managed to get through this without a massive crisis in confidence from consumers. So I think that speaks to real positivity within the system, but it also provides opportunity for us to look forward to the future for what change can be beneficial. Linda spoke about how food is essential, and we take this for granted. But COVID has brought food to the fore, we might say. And I think this provides us with an opportunity, those of all of us working in this sector, because it's a challenge that food is at the centre of things, but it's a great opportunity. And this has brought it to the fore, I think, from both a health and trade and economics perspective, which is helpful for us in many ways. I think never before do we need this a trusted evidence-based system with trusted information sources, which many of us can provide. Catherine spoke about the changes we've seen and the benefits we've seen through collaboration. And I think we've seen this from the tops of our governments right through to what we're talking about here today. Silos have been broken down and we're seeing new ways of working together, new ways of partnerships being formed, and practices that may not have been common arising for good. I think we've seen incredible resilience. Lisa spoke about, crises, not one crisis that we've had, but crises, drought, fires, floods, COVID, which has impacted it in an incredible way. But we've seen great resilience. And I would say with that, it highlights the importance of agility and flexibility to, really, at the risk of using a very overused word at the moment, to be able to pivot into new ways of working. I think in the food system at the production end, we're seeing, because of drought, fires, floods and COVID, supply chain issues, that farmers are having to really diversify their ways of working and their approaches to making an income. And I think we're seeing that right through to retail. Peter spoke about, the great advances in technology and digitisation and the opportunities and the challenges that creates. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we really need to ask ourselves, well, how do we keep up with that? How do we make sure that we regulate for the future? That is, in no doubt, moving down that track. Then I just sort of going globally and thinking about trade, we're seeing great change globally at the moment outside of food in geopolitics and in the whole way that the world is shifting at the moment, that's not only COVID related, but I think, you know, Australia and New Zealand has this unique system where we work together on this, which gives benefit to both countries that is far over and above what we could do on our own. And Catherine, I think you mentioned the opportunities for trade around this to leverage the reputation that we have and the world-class systems that we have, and taking that forward. I just want to finish on, I thought Linda's, some of the research that Linda raised about chronic disease being linked to the risk of infection, I think that provides us with something really useful to work with in regulation. I also thought that the parallel synergistic epidemic, I think that's fascinating to think about it in that context, that we've got this acute epidemic, which is extremely challenging, but at the same time, we've got the long-running, you know, the chronic epidemic of the non-communicable diseases. And, you know, what does that mean for us? What does it mean in terms of how we respond to that? So I might just end with thinking about what does this mean for the food regulatory system, which is something that we've been thinking about in terms of the modernisation agenda broadly. I think it means that the food regulatory system must be something that continues to bolster consumer confidence. We have to ensure safety and long-term public health. We must stay a science and evidence-based system. You know, COVID has actually reinforced how important science is, and it's great to see that leaders are listening to science. We need to ensure both public health and trade are equally balanced and provide that two important streams in how we move forward. We must provide regulatory certainty to the industry. And again, we just need to use our reputation to capitalise on trade opportunities. We have a world-class system, and I think the conversation today has been really exciting. I think there's great opportunity for us going forward. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Sonia. That's very skillfully put together, and I'll excuse you for going 3 minutes overtime. A very, very apt summary, and well done. And thank you to our speakers. It's been great having a chat for a couple of hours, and we've still got more than 300 people with us, which is phenomenal. So you must have been very, very interesting. But I take a lot of optimism out of that. I think there's a real strong sense of what's possible here. And it's great to have a chat to leaders such as yourselves about where we might head into the future, and so that's fantastic. Farmers that have been through a drought, that have experienced it, are better farmers when it comes to the next drought. Simple as that. And I think that in terms of facing any future challenges, I think we'll all approach it with some wisdom, with some hindsight, and with a strong sense of what's possible. So again, thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to our audience for turning up. Ngā mihi kia koutou, mā te wā. Thanks very much, and please fill out that survey. We're really keen to hear about how we might do a better job of this next time. So much appreciated, everybody. Cheerio.